thank you very much for staying. I stayed, so we're in this together. I have to apologize for my voice. My voice is a little bit weak, and I've had some problems with a hoarse voice over the last few weeks. And I also have to sit because my leg doesn't support me for very long. So, to be honest with you, I'm practically falling apart in front of you. But then again, I've been a professor since, well, I'll tell you the truth, I've been a professor since 1966. 1966, that's probably before most of your parents were born, not to speak of yourself. And interrupting that academic career has been about 20 years of activity in the United States government, including diplomatic activities and arms control negotiations in Geneva, and as Mark mentioned in my introduction. But I think it was worth waiting because I really appreciated the comments that were made by Attorney General Gonzalez. I remember him when I was watching him on television many years ago as the only Hispanic, the first Hispanic in the cabinet. I've been in the State Department, but I was never secretary. I never even got close, but I did play roles in the Department of State. In light of the time issue, since the Institute is behind time, I'm going to be quite to the point. And bear in mind that the subject of my discussion is historical. I'm going to talk about cultural diplomacy in the Cold War. The Cold War is over. When did the Cold War end? How long has it been since the Cold War became history? Does anybody know the exact precise time when the Cold War ended? I teach classes, and I've been doing it, as I said, since 1966, with the interruption of the government under the Reagan administration and Bush 1. But not that many people are aware of the date the Cold War ended. Everybody knows when World War I ended. Armistice Day, November 11th, 1918. Well, they should know. You should know. I'm not going to ask you if you do, but you should know. Everybody knows when the Second World War ended. It ended on September 2nd over the battleship Missouri when the Japanese surrendered. So I teach a history course in the Institute of World Politics, which is about 10 minutes away from here by car. And I begin my 20th century history course, and I think this has some relevance to public-cultural diplomacy and the Cold War. And the question is this. I think it's one of the most intriguing but ignored questions in the history of the world, certainly the history of the 20th century. I honestly believe, I think it is the central question to ask about international politics in the 20th century. But there are two questions, and they're related. The two are these. Why was it necessary for the Western democracies in the first half of the 20th century to wage war against the same country twice? Military war encompassing 100 million plus deaths from the air, beneath the sea, from artillery, in order to achieve their ends as they did in 1945. Why was it necessary for them to kill 100 million people? The second question is even more intriguing, and it is this. Why was it possible for the same Western democracies in the second half of the 20th century to overthrow, paralyze, and topple one of the greatest totalitarian terror regimes in world history, encompassing a continent from the North Sea to the Pacific Ocean, with 330 million people, which is about 5 times the size of Nazi Germany, a country that held approximately 40,000 nuclear weapons, every single nuclear weapon 100 times more powerful than the ones that were dropped on Japan in 1945. How was it possible for the Western democracies to end this regime without a single shot being fired? Not one. That's a rhetorical question. Don't jump up and start answering it. I don't expect that. You have opinions, perhaps. Why was it possible for the Soviet Union to dissolve against the United States of America and NATO without a single shot being fired? And why did it have to be necessary to kill 100 million people to defeat the Germans twice? I'm not going to answer it, but we haven't got time, and I'm not sure that I can. But certainly, inside that question, there has to be some measure of what the previous speaker referred to, Professor Joseph Nye, as soft power, non-military power. Remember, the Cold War was a titanic struggle between ways of life, between two heavily armed global systems, one based right here in Washington, and the other based in Moscow, which lasted almost a full half century itself. I think you can pinpoint its origins at the immediate end of the Second World War, probably in the Yalta Conference of February 1945, and its demise occurred when Boris Yeltsin announced the demise of the Soviet Union, Christmas Day, 1991. But no Russian and American or NATO soldiers faced each other over any front during that half-century period. It's one of the most neglected issues of history. And you could find hundreds, if not thousands, of books about the conclusions and nature of the First and the Second World Wars. This is the 100th anniversary of the origins of the Great War in August of 1914. But you find very little basic interest. Only a handful of books, and the Cold War seemed to come and go as though it was just a passing pat upon history to which very few people gave a great deal of attention. So that is the question, which again I say is rhetorical in nature. But in practical terms, the differences are great. Remember, the Cold War was a European and North American concept. On the margins of those, the same countries backed Allied regimes, particularly in Korea and in Vietnam, in terrible, tragic, prolonged military conflicts, which consumed, on the American side, at least close to 100,000 American soldiers alone dead in the Korean and the Vietnam wars, which spanned periods of decades. And technically, the Korean War is still in effect, technically. And you don't cross the 38th parallel. I've been there several times. You don't go there. Well, you won't come back. But there's a communist Korea, there's a communist Vietnam, there's communist Cuba, and technically there's communist China. But the Cold War is over. It's been over for 20 years. It was a European event. It's a magnificent reflection upon the distinguishing points between a hardcore traditional war in the Napoleonic or the American Civil War sense, armed masses of men in the tens and hundreds of thousands charging each other across all these fronts, versus the way in which the Cold War ended. It ended with barely a whisper. And why is that? And if you just think about the casualty list and the enormity of the experiences of the same Americans, the same countries that waged the two wars against Germany and Japan in the first half of the 20th century. The casualty list, which again I think does not really attract a great deal of attention, is overwhelming. It's absolutely overwhelming. It's almost beyond the imagination to encompass. Again, I asked my class the same question, and I have a class of about this size. And very few people can answer it with any degree of accuracy. But the Second World War, which was waged, I'll be perfectly honest with you, it was waged within my lifetime. I was alive when the Second World War was waged. None of you were, I could tell. You were not. You weren't even alive during the Vietnam War. Well, maybe. In any case, excuse me, you can tell my voice is beginning, but that'll cut the talk short, so you have time for questions. That the consensus estimate of the total number of human beings killed, men, women, and children, during World War II, well, let me ask you if anybody actually knows the consensus. It's not a scientific or precise number, but it's overwhelming in its comprehension of those killed in the Second World War. The Second World War was an event that took place in 6 years and a day. Okay? September 1st, 1939, when the Germans invaded Poland, to September 2nd, 1945, 6 years and a day, when the Japanese surrendered aboard the USS Missouri. During that 6-year period and a day, what is the estimate of men, women, and children killed in the world on all fronts across the board in 6 years? There's nothing like it in human history, and it's within my memory to say. How many? I asked my class this question. They're off by 80%. Does anybody know that? It's probably the most significant statistical point of the entire 20th century. Take a guess.
1 billion?
I'm sorry. Oh, you, what was your estimate?
1 billion.
A billion. How many million is a billion? Your estimate is close but high. The estimate, staggering estimate of the number of people killed, human beings killed on all fronts in the Second World War, is a consensus of 76 million people in 6 years. Now do the math and I'll save you the effort. That's 35,000 people a day. Every day. For 6 years, the globe witnessed 35,000 innocent people killed in a war whose origins and specifics are long since forgotten by current generations. Who remembers the invasion of Poland or the Sudeten crisis or anything like that? It's long gone. That's why I teach history. That's why historians are important. But considering that fact alone, 76 million people, and one wonders how the world can recover and then continue on in ways without looking back very long. That makes the demise of the Soviet Union with 330 million people and with 40,000 nuclear warheads and a peaceful resolution of the demise of the Soviet Union even more extraordinary and historic. Just to give you one example about the nature of the Second World War, and you'll pardon me if I go too much into history. All the rest of your week will be things that have to do with Iraq and Syria and same-sex marriage. I will not answer that. I will not. I have 3 children, so I'm 74 years old, and I'm not going to bother with it. And I'm more. Is that just take the Battle of Britain alone? Britain had 45 million people in 1940. The year I was born, 45 million people. And the so-called air blitz against the British cities took place in the summer of 40 up until 1941, or spring of 1941. The British people themselves, just isolating them alone, were attacked by the Luftwaffe, by the German Air Force, on 76 consecutive nights during that time frame, 1940-41. That is 76 consecutive nights, killing approximately 50,000 civilians, innocent British civilians. We've experienced, you all remember 9/11. Well, you certainly remember that. Can you imagine a country experiencing 76 9/11s in a row? The British did it, 1940. 76 9/11s in a row. Every night, the Luftwaffe would terrorize them, like New York was terrorized, burning them up. Coventry, Liverpool, Belfast, even Dublin. I have no idea, I'm an Irish American, why they would bomb Dublin, but they did. That's the nature of it. But the question that I'm posing for is, why was it therefore possible to dismantle the Soviet Union, which was 10 times more powerful than Germany, without a shot being fired? Do you at least agree with the thesis that the Cold War came and went as a primarily European-American event without a shot being fired? Do you accept that? Well, you have to. There is no evidence of a war between the Soviet Union and the United States. If there were wars, they were fought by what we call proxies. North Korea, North Vietnam, South Korea, South Vietnam. On either side. There were crises, the Cuban Missile Crisis and so forth, but not one ICBM rose out of its satellite and not one B-52 dropped it. The closest it came to was Dr. Strangelove, a movie in 1964. Have you ever seen Dr. Strangelove? There's a Cold War satire, highly recommended, but it's satire and it's fictitious. I had a personal experience in my school about one of the reasons why, one of the answers to the question of why the Soviet Union disappeared, peacefully under Gorbachev and then Yeltsin. And this is a true story it's an anecdote, a personal story of a visit made to my institute, which is called the Institute of World Politics, up on 16th Street Northwest, 8 blocks from the White House. I just came there from taxi, 10-minute taxi ride. It's a story of a visit by a Polish dissident who was instrumental in the beginnings of the unraveling of the Soviet Union through peaceful means. He later became president of Poland during the 1990s, and he was fairly elderly when he came in a personal visit to our school, which is presided over by the president of the school, whose father was a Polish Foreign Service officer who had deep ties to the country of Poland. His name was Lech Walesa. Does the name Lech Walesa ring a bell to anybody? Yeah. Who was Lech Walesa? He is one of the General MacArthurs of the Cold War. He was one of the people who first stood up in defiance of the occupation of the Polish state by the Red Army. Lech Walesa was a labor union leader in Poland in the 1970s. Yes. And he began a series of strikes on the docks of the port city of Gdansk in northern Poland in the 1970s. And he received worldwide fame for his defiance of the Soviet Union, and he was harassed, arrested, his family was arrested. And in that time period, the Soviet Union had about 10 years to go. Lech Walesa was probably the number one spokesman for the cause of unraveling the Soviet Union in the entire world. You may not remember him. I don't know whether he's even alive today. He was an older man. But he came to my school, I would say in 2005. And he gave a talk about his activities because the Cold War was over. It had been over for 15 years. The Soviet Union was out of Poland. Poland was free. And it was attributed to him as the chief cause for the end of the Cold War. And to a degree, rightly so. He was a lone voice in Eastern Europe under the Iron Curtain against Soviet Union. I'll never forget it. I mean, he was 10 feet in front of me. He gave his talk through an interpreter, and then we had questions and answers. And somebody asked him the question, Mr. Walesa, you were widely considered to be the greatest leader in the anti-communist cause to free Eastern Europe from Soviet domination. would you compare your contribution to the end of the Soviet Union to the contribution of the Polish Pope, who I think when he came was still alive, John Paul II, who was from Warsaw as a cardinal. And he gave this answer. And this answer, with about this many people watching in 2005 or thereabouts, offers a partial explanation to why the Soviet Union fell. It has to do with cultural diplomacy. He said, and I have it on tape, but I remember as well if it was yesterday. He said, I spent 20 years working in the shipyards of Gdansk, rounding up support to get rid of the Red Army, rounding up support to get a free Poland, rounding up support to free Poland and get the Soviet Union out of Eastern Europe, so forth. And after all those years, my family was harassed, I was put in jail, my friends were arrested, they were tortured, they were in prison. After all those years, he told the audience, I had about 20 followers who were willing to risk their lives against the Soviet Union. In 1979, in June, the newly coronated John Paul II returned to Warsaw, he said. And he gave a speech in the middle of Warsaw, and the speech said nothing about the Soviet Union. It talked about humanity, religion, culture, and human rights. Pope John Paul gave the speech in front of the cathedral at Victory Square in Warsaw. And Walesa said, the next morning, I had 20 million followers. The Pope did it. I'm reminded of an ironic statement attributed to Stalin during the course of the Second World War. When the big three were meeting at Tehran to determine the future of the war, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. Roosevelt turned to Stalin and said, you know, the Pope has now come out in support of the war effort on behalf of the Allies. Oh, okay. Stalin turned to him. He said, the Pope? Yes. How many divisions does he have? Yes. Deja vu, Stalin. The Pope has no divisions. I brought the talk with me. And I intended to go through all these documents and give a professional speech. But in light of time and the factor, I think I can just give these few points, and that will suffice to grab. This is the speech given by John Paul II in Victory Square, Warsaw, 2nd of June, 1979. Goes on for pages and pages. This is an excerpt from it, which I think addresses the heart of the cultural diplomacy, whether he was knowing it or not. John Paul II was waging a fundamental and powerful cultural war on a global scale against the Soviet Union, but he never in this talk mentioned the presence of the Red Army. He never mentioned communism. He never mentioned wars, Moscow. He never mentioned anything to do with the occupation. This is the heart of his message. And the message basically, which is, if magnified, could summarize cultural diplomacy on a larger scale. This is what it was. And the Pope was an instrumental figure in the end of the Cold War. And as Lech Walesa said, he had 20 million followers the next day. This is what he said in excerpt. The history of the nation deserves to be adequately appraised in the light of its contribution to the development of man and humanity. He's appealing to higher levels of order. To intellect, heart, and conscience, abstract concepts. This is the deepest stream of culture. It is culture's firmest support, its core, its strength. It is impossible without Christ to understand and appraise the contribution of the Polish nation to the development of man and his humanity in the past and its contribution today also. It is right to understand the history of the nation through man, each human being of this nation. At the same time, man cannot be understood apart from this community. that is constituted by the nation. Of course, it is not the only community, but it is a special community, perhaps that most intimately linked with the family, the most important of all for the spiritual history of man. So just this little, excerpt from a much longer speech identifies the appeal that a cultural approach to a conflict which was being waged for the survival and the destiny of the globe as it was defined appeals to family, nation, conscious, individuality, and so forth. That is certainly one aspect of the larger dimension of cultural diplomacy that was waged in the entirety of the Cold War. Now, I'm going to come to basically a close to this. I was going to read a whole series of comments and notes of that nature and so forth, but in the interest of time, since we've lost so much time, I think this kind of a notion of a non-military, spiritual, communal aspect of humanity has been used by successive administrations in the United States as a strategic tool to appeal above the heads of the leadership of foreign dictatorships, including that of Stalin and his successors, Brezhnev and his successors, to undermine the legitimacy of their rule and to demonstrate, without a shot being fired, the power of ideas and ideals that the Pope demonstrated in 1979 that is like smoke from artillery. It cannot be seen, but like some kind of an osmosis, it seeps into the body politic. And through its utility, it erodes the confidence of the leadership to continue. And they then just, to use the Marxist phrase, they themselves, the leader of the greatest Marxist nation on earth, they're the ones that, in the Marxist phrase, withered away. The Western allies in capitalism didn't wither away. They withered away. And the instruments or tools that were used by successive administrations and cultural diplomacy can be traced back in its American use to World War I and World War II, used by Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson in World War I, to use the cultural wellsprings of the country and communicate those ideas to alien publics despite the efforts of the ruling elite, the one percenters, to overcome that. And how did they do it? They did it through the use of non-military means, particularly radio broadcasts. USIA was founded in 1952 or 53, United States Information Agency. Its purpose was to send out a message of ideals in non-military senses to all the globe. Radio Free Europe, the Voice of America. Those were the instruments of power that were used for decades to undermine the Soviet Union. I'm talking about cultural exchanges. I'm talking about non-white Americans such as Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Michael Jackson, and others who went into the Soviet Union. I'm talking about the Beatles. I'm talking about blue jeans, transistor radios, jazz music. Why did the Soviet Union spend billions of dollars trying to jam those broadcasts for decades? That was the artillery of the Cold War. I'll give you another anecdote about the effect of cultural diplomacy in undermining Soviet rule against their will, which brought them down. Some aspects of this demise of the Soviet Union are attributed to Gorbachev himself, who did a great deal to contribute to his own demise. That's accurate. But he had a lot of help. I have a friend of mine who just passed away, I'm sorry to say, who wrote a book called Architects of Victory. It's called Architects of Victory. It was published about 20 years ago. It indicates the several individuals throughout history who were mostly responsible for the demise of communist rule in Europe. And he goes back to Konrad Adenauer, the first premier of a free Germany. He goes back to Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who happened to have the luxury of meeting when he was at the Hoover Institution in the 1970s. He didn't shoot anybody. Adenauer didn't shoot anybody. He mentions Harry Truman, who devised one of the greatest cultural diplomatic efforts of the Cold War, which I'll mention in a second. Ronald Reagan, the Czechoslovakia leader, Havel, how do you pronounce his name? Václav Havel, and Pope John Paul II, and a couple of others. These were people who had no military background, never shot, but they were the ones who were instrumental in the end of the Cold War. And I'll end shortly, but one anecdote may suffice. The most famous disc jockey in the history of the world was heard by about 30 million people worldwide. His name was Willis Conover. Now, America is the home of disc jockeys. And American disc jockeys broadcast rock and roll music for going back to the 40s and 50s, listened to by millions of Americans. His name was Willis Conover. He worked for the United States Information Agency. A single American never heard his voice. No American teenager listening to Elvis Presley or the Beatles or the Rolling Stones will ever hear of Willis Conover. He was a disc jockey for Voice of America. He played jazz and other American music for decades in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, into the Iron Curtain. Despite efforts to jam that were done by the Soviet Union, he would broadcast to 30 million people with clandestine radio sets. Willis Conover. Everybody ever heard of Willis Conover? You have? Oh, well, it's good to hear. Maybe you would listen to it during its day. And one final anecdote, which highlights a non-military political/cultural dimension to strategic conflict or to strategic ambition or competition, occurred shortly after the end of the Second World War, when the Cold War had already begun in earnest. The so-called Iron Curtain, in Churchill's phrase, had descended upon Europe as early as 1945, and the division of Europe and Germany was rigid. And in 1948, in June, I think, Stalin closed the traffic from the west to the city of Berlin, which was located 90 miles from the western frontier, in East Berlin, East Germany, I mean. And he kept it closed for nearly a year. The United States had a number of options as to how to, this was probably the greatest crisis, maybe in the history of the entire Cold War, with the possible exception of the Cuban Missile Crisis. How do you respond to Stalin's closing of all traffic? There's 2 million people in West Berlin. If they're going to starve to death or fall under totalitarian rule unless something is done. A tremendous amount of pressure was exerted upon the Truman administration to bomb the Soviet Union itself. The Soviet Union at that point had no atomic weapons. The United States had its sole possession of atomic weapons and was perfectly capable of eliminating the Soviet Union and the Red Army as a threat. But Truman rejected calls for military operations and instead imposed a historic decision to feed, clothe, fuel the population of West Berlin for as long as it took. So instead of declaring war, instead of declaring any kind of military action, which was, you can tell, it was very vulnerable and the pressure was quite high, he inaugurated the airlift, which lasted for over a year, from May until about June, and it continued on until 1949. And at that point, during the entire year, the Western Allies, Britain, France, and the United States, fed the population of West Berlin through the air, transforming the same bombers that had obliterated Hamburg and Berlin into cargo planes, flying food and fuel and supplies into Berlin until Stalin finally relented and opened the borders in June of 1949. At the height of the airlift, excuse me, I'm definitely going to have to close because I'm really running out of time and voice. The height of the lift in early April 1949, in a 24-hour period, a total of about 1,300 round trips or sorties were taken. That is one every 58 seconds. I think, looking back upon the spectrum of the Cold War, going back into Korea, the Cuban crisis, the Vietnam War, and even today, I honestly cannot believe that there was a time period in which the name, the United States of America, and the Western Allies, there was no NATO, NATO would come the next year, had such high appeal around the world under a non-military airlift of supplies, which with some definition could be called an aspect of a certainly non-military cultural or cultural diplomacy, as was under the Truman administration in 1948. I think this was the pinnacle, and it was not only diplomatically, but it was one of the most highly successful and applauded moments in the 50-year history of the Cold War. And that's cultural diplomacy. And during the Cold War, it was supplemented by the defense buildup by the Reagan administration, by economic warfare and others. But the influence of the radios, of the dance teams, the athletic teams, the exchanges on all fronts, probably elevated cultural diplomacy to its highest levels in the history. And I brought with me a book for your further reading. As you know, don't forget, I am a professor. This is by somebody who knows cultural diplomacy much better than I. I'm just going to offer it for your interest. It's called The Dancer Defects by British historian David Caute, C-A-U-T-E. I was going to read to you his conclusion, but I won't even bother. I'll let you do it yourself. It's a heavy book, but it is the definitive story of cultural diplomacy during the historic Cold War. The Struggle for Cultural Supremacy During the Cold War by British historian David Caute. That'll be your assignment for next week. I say that all the time. I don't mean it. I don't even mean it with the class. Thank you.